Welcome to our 12th Fireside Chat. It's kind of hard to believe that this is our 12th one, but we're very excited to continue this. I'm Craig Galati with LGA, and thank you for constantly showing up to these important conversations that we're able to have. And I hope that you can keep these conversations going after the end of the chat. So we began these chats as a way to connect our clients and our colleagues around important issues that were facing our community, and how we as designers and community members could work together to create great places. You know, those places that we all love, the ones that are worthy of remembering, to create great experiences, and the ones that we have stories around, those are the kind of places we're talking about. So before we jump in though, I got a few logistics. So we have a chat feature on the Zoom. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Zoom these days, but please put some questions, put some thoughts in there. We have a specific time built in that we're gonna try to ask those questions to our panelists, but I'll monitor the chat, and if something needs to be broken in, I'm break right in and we'll go ahead and ask those questions as we go. So please go ahead and do that, and I'll be monitoring them. One other item is that this chat is being recorded. It's going to be available on our website within a week or so, and those of you who have attended a number of these, you'll know that since you registered, you're going to get a link to it at some point once we get it all put together. So my partner, Jason Jajorian, is actually going to be interviewing all our panelists today. And I'm going to introduce him in just a minute. So let's jump into this. Tonight's Fireside Chat is entitled Social and Environmental Placemaking. During the pandemic, widespread understanding that connecting to nature as an essential part of a healthy human condition was brought to light. For many of us, parks and other outdoor recreational environments served as the place we went for mental and social healing. However, many cities have not been designed to provide these experiences, especially to all people, those underserved areas. Therefore, the question becomes, what can we as designers, academics, policymakers, can we do to provide equitable urban communities? So we're pleased to have two rock stars with us tonight, and I'm very excited to be able to introduce them. Alden Stoner is the CEO of Nature Sacred. Under her leadership, Nature Sacred has transformed from a grant-giving organization to an operating foundation to improve individual and community wellness by expanding its existing over 100 community-led contemplative green spaces, what they call sacred places, across the country. The organization has been working diligently for over 25 years to create the places that communities need and love. Prior to becoming the CEO of this organization, Alden was a board member of Nature Sacred and co-directed and produced several short films around the organization's National Nature Sacred Award winners. Alden comes from a marketing background where she led marketing and operations at several companies, including Quantified Ventures, where she led company-wide initiatives such as the creation of their first ever impact report and their B Corp certification. She's joining us from Annapolis, Maryland, where she has the opportunity to paddleboard on the Chesapeake Bay. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Angela Loder is the Vice President of Research at the Well Building Institute. Dr. Loder is responsible for identifying, directing, and managing evidence-based research to support the well building standard. Her key projects include collating the development of the global research agenda on health, well-being, and the built environment for all well certified projects. As a research scientist, strategic partner, and educator, Angela brings over a decade of experience in interdisciplinary research and partnerships around occupant health, well-being, and built environment. Prior to joining the Well Building Institute, she ran her own consulting firm focused on urban planning, sustainability, and health. Her book, Small Scale Urban Greening, Creating Places of Health, Creativity, and Ecological Sustainability, was published in 2020. She's joining us from Denver. So welcome to you too, Angela. Thank you for both of you for joining. Take it away, Jason.
Thank you, Craig. I know this is a little bit of role reversal for us. Usually it's the other way around on the intro, but you did a great job. Thank you. Angela and Alden, it's great to see you on screen with us here today. Thank you for taking the time. But let's just jump right into the content. Let's start with Angela, and I guess this is my time to use my prop here. Since meeting you the first time, Angela, I've read your book. Here it is. There it is. Great research and the conclusions, and it put a lot of different perspectives to what we're going to talk about today. So maybe we can start with you, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what's the background for you and your inspiration for writing the book, and then maybe talk a little bit about the insights you found during your research.
Absolutely. So I've studied people and the environment and their environment at multiple scales for a long time. I love, building level all the way to urban planning. And one of my areas of focus was sort of access to nature and how that impacts people, how that impacts their health and well-being is what I did my doctorate on. And what I really wanted to look at was I wanted to capture trends that I was seeing across the US and Canada in particular in big cities, where they're really having a different idea of urban greening. They weren't tearing down, central business districts to create an urban park. They're putting like greenery on top of roofs. They were, using unused rail lines. They were finding spaces to put the green space in the kind of the crevices of the city. And it really looked like a reimagining of what this looked like. And I wanted to capture what some of those trends and some of the themes were. And on the flip side, a lot of these well-intentioned projects were still facing community resistance. So, we all know nature is good for us, and yet why was there conflict happening? Why were, communities saying, I don't want this, or there was issues around equity? So I really started to dive into what some of those issues were around the research. On the one hand says, hey, everything's great, versus what was actually happening on the ground. I think you asked about insights as well, correct?
Yeah.
Right. So I think a couple of key things that I've learned in the course of writing that book. One is that you need extra childcare if you have small children to write a book. Hilarious aside, but anyways, but seriously, the first is that there's a shift in public health. A shift in idea that a lack of green space is actually being recognized as a public health risk. We've always known that it's benefit, like the City Beautiful movement, let's have green space for socialization, social benefits, but now they're really looking at it from like an equity perspective, saying, this is in our policies. We said we're going to have everybody within a 10-minute walk, and we don't, and they don't have access to high quality green space. This is an issue. And this is kind of across the board, this new shift in lack of high quality green space is a public health risk. So they're rethinking what that benefit means. The second is that I'm really seeing an innovative approach to policy in which traditional ways of doing things, so an engineering big pipe approach for say stormwater management or just updating a park, it isn't working anymore. What they need to do is to blend different departments and have community activism and community engagement is a key component of that. And the third one, I think, is really the fact that the economic and social context is huge here. Some of the research that we've seen, or a lot of the research is saying that biodiversity leads to better mental health benefits. We know that people that look at sort of more biodiverse areas tend to feel more restored, they've had less stress. And yet, in some of these communities, people are tearing down, say, mature trees. They were making it look neat and clean. And this really contradicts what the research says. So it was really coming forward, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more later, but what was really coming forward was that the context matters. If people are living in disadvantaged neighborhoods, something that looks wild, they're associated with neglect and with lack of safety. And in fact, there's really great population level data around this. So that really begs the question around this tension. How do you provide an amenity community investment for these neighborhoods, but also be able to provide that extra benefit around sort of aesthetics and nature that has got ecological benefits, but also doesn't make them feel further disadvantaged?
Yeah, that's a great point. Most people think cutting down trees, for instance, what happened in the large lots research you covered in Chicago, that would have been like a complete negative. Like, why are we doing that? Especially in our environment, trees are a resource in the desert. But but that's part of the social impact, and where not everyone perspectives are different depending on where you're coming from. One of the examples you use, I believe you're going to talk about it. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the Highline
Yes.
project. And as designers, we use examples of Highline all the time. Like, it's a beautiful place and a lot of popularity. However, one of the big aha moments when reading your book was there's actually some negative impact socially in the local neighborhoods there. Do they use it? And I think that that's something hopefully we talk a little bit more about today. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Alden, let's move to you. And I really enjoyed going through your website and learning more about your organization, Nature Sacred. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the practice of creating sacred places.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you all for having us here. I'm so excited to be here as a part of this, and I'm already pulling so many threads from even what Angela was saying. And, you know, because one of the big ones is community engagement, and I'll get to that in just a second, because it's so mission critical for these things, for these green spaces, or what we call sacred places, to be sustainable over the long haul. But so essentially what we do at Nature Sacred is we bring nature to people. We bring nature to people who are in need. And there are essentially 4 core principles, and that they're open. So they're open to all people. They're nearby. They're where we live, work, play, and heal. They are sacred. And what we mean by that is that they're designed for mindful reflection. They're designed to create individual and community peace. And then they are community led. So that community led stewardship is the most essential piece, right? It's got to be open to all, but it's got to come from the community. And we know that because we have over 100 sacred places from across the country. And we were doing this 25 years ago when people were like, what's the sacred thing about? I mean, people thought we were a little, you know, woo-woo. But the truth is that now, with mindfulness being more mainstream, with the tsunami of mental health underneath the current pandemic, and the real recognition that we need access to these spaces. Some of us are lucky enough that we had backyards or close by green spaces in the course of the lockdown, but many, many, many people did not, whether they were in an under-resourced neighborhood or in a hospital. And, you know, just that, having that access, that place to breathe and just take a moment for yourself. But the practice of what we do is we put people at the center of the process. And so there is a deep community engagement aspect to what we do from start to finish. It starts with what we call the Fire Soul, which is a community leader. And they recognize the need, they bring the community together, and then we pair them with our design advisors, whether it's a landscape architect or a landscape designer, to help them realize that vision. And it's their vision of what is sacred to them. And so that's the sort of at the core of the practice. There's a lot more details, but that's, you know, the high level.
All right. Well, thank you for that explanation. Do you have is there one story or one sacred place that really stands out to you?
There are too many to count, but this one is just probably signifies that change the most. So there is it was an open lot. It was essentially 2 open lots in Baltimore, and Baltimore faces a great deal of open lots, vacancies, et cetera. It's a real challenge for Baltimore. And that's where sort of our hub is. We're based in Annapolis, but we started in Annapolis, Washington, and Baltimore. And there's a group called Bon Secours Community Works, and they are doing some incredible work sort of redeveloping Baltimore. And there was this one area called Kirby Lane Park. It wasn't a park yet, it was just Kirby Lane. And this community, before, it was when there was an open lot and there was rubble and trash and things like that, the folks in the community played horseshoes on this open lot. And that was their fun time, right? That was their available space. And so then Bon Secours came to talk about this idea of creating a green space, and what has emerged is a serenity garden called Kirby Lane Park. But it was in the charrette process, in the community engagement process, where the folks said, this is your space. And at first, the residents didn't necessarily believe that. But with the adamant and fervent fire within the Fire Soul, they said, no, this is yours. And there was a conversation about horseshoes. They said, oh, so this really is for us. And so then they started to recognize that they had input and really designed the whole place. And so now it's the Serenity Garden. And in the first 3 weeks or so of lockdown, they were supposed to finish this mural, and they went out and did it just after the first 2 weeks, you know, so it was all sort of okay. But it transformed the whole neighborhood, and people drive by and just see it now as a place of hope. And there are now new sites that are popping up all around. And that's a great example of where one place can be sort of an acupuncture point for a larger movement.
Right. And I'm sure, I think there's many different sacred places. I think one that comes to mind here locally is the Las Vegas Community Healing Garden that was created after the October 1st shooting, not too far from us. And the community involvement actually helped. That process that happened over a week to create this park, I think, was part of the healing too, of that space. So,
yeah, the process is as important as the outcome, for sure.
Correct. So thank you for that story. And I think that probably leads us to our next question. And this could be for both of you. And maybe we start with Angela. Alden talked about a meaningful place, but what makes an urban space meaningful to a community? Maybe talk a little bit more about that.
It's a great question, and I love following Alden's great example, because I think we've seen that it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge, giant project. What makes it meaningful is that it's something that people experience every day. In the research, they call that nearby nature. They said actually part of the problem traditionally is that we spend so much effort preserving so-called wilderness, which is absolutely worth preserving, but that is like this far distant abstract idea versus kind of the everyday, which they call the profane, right? There's a great article written about the sacred and the profane. If that's the only thing that's sacred, then everything else becomes profane and up for grabs, and it's a vacant lot and worthless until you sell it for money instead of maybe wildflowers living there and other things like that. So it needs to be nearby and part of their daily lived experience. It's particularly important because a lot of the communities that need it the most have cumulative stressors, right? And these cumulative stressors are not going to be solved by a garden, but it's called toxic stress in literature, poverty, systemic racism, and also violence. But nature can act as a buffer and to help sort of reduce some of that stress. And there's great research around that. So having it part of their daily lived experience, having it local, and having really from what, Alden's talked about, I've seen as well in the case studies that I looked at, having community involvement is key. So there was a wonderful project in Chicago called the Chicago Resilient Corridors Project that was really spearheaded by Michael Berkshire and others. And this was looking at blending ecological goals, in this case, stormwater management, where this neighborhood is flooding all the time, as well as very, very serious social and economic goals, high levels of violence, high levels of poverty. And they managed to get funding to deal with the stormwater, but an essential part of that was that they created jobs locally. They hired exclusively locally, which was really important because they need to build trust. And then they let the residents choose. They had a native palette of plants so that it was sort of, stormwater management and plants, but the locals could choose it. And I think they were so impressed from the stories that have been told anecdotally about this, that they were like, this is for us, and this is something that they walk past on the way to school. It manages stormwater, so it reduces flooding, but it is part of this spine, this green spine connecting these neighborhoods, and it really shifts that sense of place. A lot of these neighborhoods really have a very negative sense of place, and giving them something that is positive, they could potentially connect them to the wildlife outside the city. It gives them a positive educational experience for small children. All of those things can really make a space meaningful. And key to that is also the role of art. So just like what Alden is mentioning, the role of sort of community activism to keep this thing alive, to bring this to counselors, as well as involving artists. There's a lot of murals, a lot of artist activities in almost every single space that we've looked at. Education is a key component of it, as well as, to be honest, getting them to co-design it, which really means a rethinking of how cities have done it. And, happy to talk about that later, but that is particularly important because on a practical level, cities don't have the money to maintain it. So they need the community to maintain it, which means they need the community to have ownership of that space.
Right. Those are great points. I love the connection to art, because I think that those are one of the things that move from, like a tourist attraction to something that's more authentic to that community. So. Alden, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to first answer it with a specific example, because I think on some level it always helps to ground. But one example is one of our sacred places is in Joplin, Missouri, where there was an EF5 tornado and over 160 people were killed and 10,000 trees decimated. It was just incredibly tragic. And the community was devastated on every level. But they came together and decided to, a place called Cunningham Park was the place that the tornado became the EF5. So it was their version of ground zero. And they came together and designed this incredible sacred place, the butterfly garden and overlook. And so there's all these pollinator elements, et cetera. But sort of to Angela's point on the art aspect or the hardscaping that can accompany the landscaping is that there is this water wall that says hope on it. And it has 38 sections, one for every of the 38 minutes that EF5 tornado was on the ground. And so there is meaning making in that aspect of it, in addition to the green space. And the other thing I'll share, which is something that we have in each one of our sacred places, is underneath our signature bench. There's actually a picture of one behind me. There's a little waterproof journal. And so there's a journal in each one of these places, and the meaning making that happens with those who are users of the space, and not just the individual who's writing about their experience, whether it's, we've had wedding proposals in the spaces, we've had those people who are grieving, we've had just people who are grateful for the beautiful day. It has really run the gamut, but there's also, I sort of like to call it an analog Twitter. There's often a call and response. I mean, there have been people who have been dealing with, suicidal thoughts, and then others come back and say, no, you are loved, we are here. And, wow. And then there's others where somebody will say something sort of silly and they're like, that's not appropriate for this journal. And it's just really interesting, the sort of call and response. And so that community can come together in that way as well.
I love the ownership of that and the self-regulation of that journal. I mean, that's amazing. And so, and I think both of you talked about the community engagement, right? That's a huge piece to bringing meaning to place. I can't think of too many successful community projects that don't have some type of engagement or outreach. So maybe if you want, so like a bottom-up approach versus always a top-down approach, it has to be balanced. It can't just come from one direction. So in these places, what are some other qualities or speak to for you, in addition to community engagement, is about activation? I think Alden, you told a great story that that makes it more inclusive and equitable for all. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, our process includes sort of pre-canvassing charrettes, at least 2 with the community. And then in some cases, and we're working on a sacred place with the Community Foundation in Des Moines. They had a permit deadline, so they sort of accelerated the process, but they had people going down kind of door to door, and they were the Community Foundation, so they had that sort of platform going door to door, asking different groups of people what they thought, and including hosting a number of people in the homeless shelter, and just having the individuals from the foundation write down their answers. So it does take more work, and it's not the easiest path. It's not the path of least resistance, but it's the path where there's more of an objective of long-term stewardship and of respect for the space. And so, as Angela said, a lot of these municipalities or other institutions don't necessarily have the dollars for the long-term maintenance. So that's where you really need the community to play in. And if you do it right up front, your likelihood of success goes way up on the backside.
Absolutely.
Yeah, to sort of piggyback onto what Alden is saying, I think though the communities that need it the most, it's really important that that's part of the process. At a citywide scale, I think one of the things that has come up really strongly in my research is that the sort of value neutral approach to urban greening, like the very well-meaning, but that has limitations, say nature RX to prescription nature, like just go for a walk in nature, it's fine. It's really wonderful, but it doesn't take into account what we call in public health socio-ecological barriers. So if you live in a food desert, or you need to cross 6 lanes of highway to get to work, you should just bike to work, or you should just go eat a healthy food. Those are very real barriers that makes the kind of the healthy choice or the good choice difficult. Mm-hmm. And that line, and I think traditionally they said, oh, well, just, use the park nearby. But if that park isn't viable, or that park isn't really meeting the needs of what that community wants, then that's not really equitable. So I think communities and cities are really rethinking what that means. And one of the sort of areas we still need to work on is that the research that cities have traditionally drawn upon tends for the most part to be mostly environmental psychology. And it's a broad term. There's a lot of different disciplines in that, but that is because it tends to use statistics as a method to collect data. And statistics are very helpful because it says, well, this is what is best for the population. It's a very good way to sort of justify the public use of funds. There's been a shying away of in qualitative work, like what Alden is talking about. It's dismissed as merely anecdotal. There hasn't been as much use of some academic work that's talked about values, conflicts, aesthetics around access to nature. The classic example is wilderness a beautiful, fantastic thing, or is it a threatening wasteland? Well, for early settlers to the US, it was a threatening wasteland, right? So there's a lot of cultural values and other aspects that we don't always talk about how people view urban greening projects. For example, some immigrant communities have been terrified of having naturalized lawns and these long grasses in these urban greening projects because where they come from, there's poisonous snakes in the grass. Right. So really, I think at a policy level, being able to understand that, yes, we all know that nature is good for you, but that the context and the local values and aesthetics and experiences matter enormously. So to go back to that, discussion around equity with aesthetics, if somebody's living in most of the research to date has been on affluent white neighborhoods, to be quite frank, about the benefits of nature. And there's still benefits, of course, to big mature trees and wild land for disadvantaged communities, but it needs a special attention. It needs things we call like cues to care, which are symbols that it's being taken care of. It needs symbols of maintenance. And those so-called sort of cleaning and greening, I think that maybe is the first step to say, hey, somebody lives here, this is being taken care of. Right. They've shown that those kind of programs in Philadelphia have greatly reduced gun violence and maybe it feels safer, they've had mental health benefits. That would be like phase one. And as people get more comfortable owning that space, then we can start maybe introducing with programming, so the kind of work that Alden's organization is doing, with programming to say, hey, let's add in habitat or a butterfly garden or educational programming, because those kinds of spaces in the end are going to give the most benefit to mental health, to stress, to community building, but they need to acknowledge that context first. So I think maybe the takeaway here is if we really want to talk about equity, we really have to understand the context within which that is happening and that one size doesn't fit all. And of course, displacement. We need to discuss land trusts and green gentrification, but that's probably a whole other conversation. So
right. Wow. Thank you for sharing, Angela. And I guess understanding that context only happens with giving a seat at the table to community and where these projects happen, right? Without that voice, policymakers are going to have the statistics and they're going to implement from a top-down perspective only. So I think let's move on. And, we're talking our context, we're talking in more urban areas, right, for greening projects. And if you live in the suburbs, cities plan for these big parks, and they're planned so often where everyone in the suburb can, within a 10-minute walk and get to this park. But in urban contexts, it's a little, the available space for that to happen is not there. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about successful small-scale urban projects, urban greening projects. And I think that's the title of your book, Angela. So that's.
Yeah, I think there's a couple trends that we've seen. Green roofs are one of them. There's a huge amount of unused space on rooftops. It's not always appropriate for everything, but they've done food production, even in like low-income communities worldwide. There's some calls that for successful habitat, that roofs have to play a huge part in climate change adaptation mitigation. There's a new report out. And in fact, in terms of climate change, the role of habitat is essential for addressing climate change. So I think even though small scale urban green spaces can play a huge component of that, it can tap into existing planning modes. So nodes and corridors is a well-used sort of planning trope where you have sort of higher development along corridors and you have these nodes. You can do the same thing for green space. So nodes, corridors, there's something called landscape urbanism, which is a term for sort of that rethinking of what the city can be, especially post-industrial cities, sort of the Rust Belt cities. really taking that industrial history, and this is what happened in the rail park, and really celebrating that post-industrial history and rethinking what that means for the city. It's like a creative rebirth. And that can happen in elevated lines. It's a little bit different than green roofs. Green roofs aren't always accessible.
Right.
And I think the last thing is these, these interstitial spaces. They can be small corridors. They can be like that Chicago Resilient Corridors project is like that hell strip on between the street and the sidewalk. That is big enough to make a difference. And I think that is where we're going to see the most impact. And we're talking about that daily lived experience. It's great to have those parks to go to, but is that what you pass by every day to go shopping or go to work or pick up your kids from daycare?
Right. So Alden, you want to add to that statement?
Yeah.
And maybe also talk about the roles that make it happen. What, and I think you talked about the fire soul. What are the other roles? Like what happened? What's the whole mix?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and address all of that, but I think Angela's book's awesome, by the way, just for everyone. I mean, it's so true that the different, I just loved reading it because it does talk about the various ways that we can be so much more creative with our space, because it has to be, right? Especially in these urban environments, we have to be thoughtful and creative. And some of our sacred places are really small, and that's okay. Like that works. That's the piece that I get really excited about. And there's one particular space in Baltimore, what was an open lot on a corner, very busy street corner. You hear traffic. If you're standing there on the sidewalk, you walk 3 steps in, and I'm not exaggerating, the sound goes down by like 3-fold. And because there's just a few trees, and you get this sense of surround. And of course, your cortisol levels decrease, but also just your whole, experience is so much more peaceful, even though you're 3 steps from where you were 1 second ago. So, and that's just not a very big swath of land. And so these have outsized impacts, both environmental and human impacts, as well as community. But in terms of the different roles, the fire soul is the most critical. These are people who usually have day jobs, at least, but recognize the need, and it's that passion that burns in them. And many of our fire souls are 20 years plus, but we also have second generation fire souls, and we're preparing for others to take the reins, and that's a really important piece. And so we at Nature Sacred are there for the long haul. So we're not build it and leave. We are really there for the whole design process, and then continue on to support these fire souls and network them together. So all of that is really important, because there's a great deal of learning that they can do from one another. And the other critical roles are the design advisors. So having a group of landscape architects or designers who can take the time, who really listen to what the community needs, and who translates that back into something truly beautiful, because all people, certainly deserve beauty in their worlds. And so that's a piece of it. And so those are, I think, the key pieces. But I just want to pull one other thing from what Angela said with the last question in terms of those cues, which I think is so key, but is the signage, how important signage is in all of these locations to help inform what kind of space you're entering. And so that's, I think, a really important piece as we look to create different kinds, whether it's just that middle swath of land of, hey, this is a pollinator area, just so you know what's happening, or you are entering a place for reflection, or go off and play tennis over there, whatever the case is trying to sort of create that conversation.
Yeah, the signage is really important. Just having that adds to the experience, right? And feeling more welcome, feeling more permission to do things from a visitor experience. And I love your story about the impact of trees. And I think we covered recently, like just 20 seconds in nature can reduce the heart rate. 20 seconds. And many times people go days without that kind of connection at all. Craig, you're on the.
I popped in because I think there's a question I don't want to miss. There's actually quite a few questions, but I'd like to ask this one. And how can urban green space on rooftop decks be implemented in the desert community like Las Vegas? The idea is very amazing. However, how do we do that here in our environment?
It's a really great question. And you would never know it from downtown Denver, but actually this is a semi-arid desert as well. And yes, so the first thing to address is that a lot of people that live in the desert didn't grow up in the desert. And so their expectations of what green space is are not xeriscaping. And when they look at a green roof, if it's xeriscaped, they'll be like, it's dead, it's ugly, it's got little cactus. That's not what I want, right? What they want, for the most part, is on a day-to-day basis is lush green space. That makes them feel good. And those are cultural values that we have to address right up front, because otherwise they're going to be criticisms that the green roof is failing, that it's not working. Any plant is going to need maintenance. And I, did my doctoral work on green roofs. I'm married to a landscape horticulturalist who's installed green roofs. It's going to need maintenance, just like any living thing. But I think there are ways you can do it in the desert, which use xeriscaping, and then maybe has a few annual plants as Alden and I have been discussing, of those cues to care. And there's ways that you can make it look designed. So the Chicago City Hall green roof is a very famous award-winning green roof. And from some angles, it can look a little wild. In fact, it made people think about the prairie, which is pretty amazing given there's almost no natural prairie left in that region. But from very high up, you could see very clearly that it was maintained, and then it had this sort of series of spirals and concentric circles. So using design cues to show that, hey, that scruffy look is on purpose. Pops of seasonal color can really help with that seasonality, and also showing that it's for habitat. So people are much more, aesthetics is pretty interesting because it's one of the few things that people can shift their ideas about, especially if they have information and it's not just for their own pleasure, but it's for habitat. So if you use green roofs, and there's ways to sort of gather water, of course, and use low water. They do need a little bit when they're, they do need a little bit at the very beginning to get them settled. And then if you have an extensive dry patch, then you need things to just keep the plants alive unless they go dormant. And the conditions on a rooftop, of course, are much drier, much windier than usual, but there are ways to do it. We have living roofs here that they're very successful. But if people know that it's for habitat, if they know that it's got a different aesthetic and you have signage and education around it, you can make green roofs work there. The last thing I'll say on green roofs is they did a study here on the DOE building in downtown Denver, and even not taking into account, say, the plant life, that was a modular system. I would not recommend a modular system for deserts. You want it to be sort of a more in-place system, just for water retention. It's just modulars don't work well in dry climates. But even if, say, part of the roof failed, it doubles the life of the roof, and it moderates that temperature in terms of freezing, even in the winter. So there's moments in the summertime when plants will sort of cool that temperature in the hottest time of the day, which really reduces the heating and cooling costs in the city. And there's times in the winter will reduce the freezing. So from an ecological perspective, there's still a lot of value at the building scale and the city scale for having green roofs in those climates.
That's a great point, because it's a double whammy with the impacts. Just creating from a environmental standpoint, the roof insulation is the best way to deal with a strong envelope, right? And so that protection from interior space is very important too. That was a great question. Thank you, Craig, because that also touches upon, we wanted to tie into our area here in Las Vegas, arid, dry climate here. And maybe Angela, maybe talk a little bit more about other opportunities for a city like Las Vegas. We do have a lot of vacant land downtown, amazingly enormous amount, surprisingly. So it seems like there's opportunities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Opportunities
other opportunities for Las Vegas, possibly.
Absolutely. And I think Las Vegas, amazingly so, Las Vegas has an incredibly high use of water, not surprisingly, in the middle of the desert, but the reuse rate is the best in the country. But you're still in the desert, there's evaporation. So I think the best options in terms of the creative reuse is a combination of xeriscaping and placemaking. I think a lot of the work that Alden's organization is doing has, that small scale mimicking the hinterland is a really important way to placemake. Las Vegas doesn't really refer whatsoever to that gorgeous desert outside of Las Vegas. It's beautiful, but there's almost no signage or symbolism to make people think that. And there's a great thing called the pigeon paradox, in which you're like, how do you expect us to care about the nature outside when the only thing we associate with nature is a patch of grass and pigeons? So if you teach people about that amazing wildlife and nature and the desert plants, by mimicking that inside the city, it really creates that sense of place, and it makes them care about it a little bit more. And I'm sure Alden has, more to say about sort of that kind of placemaking. But the vacant lot opportunities, I think, need to come from both a ground up and a top down level. And Philadelphia and Chicago have some great examples of policy tools to do that.
Right. Oh, thank you. Alden, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that in truth, we've been talking about green space that's in our mission since our inception. And I'm not sure we've been thinking as much about Las Vegas as we should, because the truth is that, it is green space, or it's nature. It's really nature is what we're going for. And that can be, the beautiful red rocks outside of Las Vegas, bringing those in some way, to Angela's point, to sort of do that mimicry. And so it's creating that opportunity to connect with something other than concrete or other sort of human-made infrastructure. And it's the placemaking that process can be, can inform some other exciting and cool attributes to the place itself. So it doesn't all have to be lush and green, but it's I'm appreciating this different perspective. So
I love, in downtown Las Vegas, you may not know we are in the desert environment. We go outside the city and we see the beauty of the desert, but that's not a lot of times brought into the city. So that's a great point of connecting to this place that we live here. So let's move on. Alden, let's stay with you. We have a lot of nonprofit leaders on this call today, and there'll be some policymakers who watch this video in the future. So, and it's, the economics of it's always a question mark, right? How does it happen? So maybe can you speak a little bit about the funding sources that you're familiar with to help create urban healing spaces?
Yeah, I think I can. And I also just want to say that the economic piece is a really important argument. And we're actually working on a health economics white paper that will be coming out next spring, because really it is a relatively small investment for a very large impact. I mean, you're impacting so many people. If you're a public policymaker, you're looking at a grand scheme. If you're a corporation and thinking about your employees and or your customers, it is a very, very big impact multiple for what it is you're investing in that. And in terms of, different places to look for those funds, I will share, actually, we have a call for proposals right now that's open. So if people, have what they think might become a sacred place, you can reach out to us at Nature Sacred. But I think, and what we do is take people through that initial process to get to the design. And those are always the hardest dollars to find, because once you get on paper, the labyrinth is here and the water features there, or the red rocks are over here, whatever the case may be, then it's so much easier to gather dollars around. And we found that time and time again. That's what really unlocks the bigger capital. And it comes from a variety of sources, from individuals, from foundations, lots of support in different ways, sometimes financial from municipalities and things like that. But there are different nonprofits foundations that are, across the country, and some are very localized, like they're just for Baltimore or Memphis or whatever the case may be. And others, Robert Wood Johnson is doing a lot in this arena. So there are places to do that, but it is depending on what your sort of audience or who your decision makers are. There are other ways to access capital and to unlock capital. I mean, again, if you're a corporation, that's right. There's a way to think about that. That's actually a very big net positive. Right.
And I think in our, if you're familiar with Las Vegas growth over the decades, is like every decade we double our population, and it's been expanding. And I heard of a startling fact recently because of that growth, and it takes 10 years of taxes for every person to pay for the infrastructure for that person. And so obviously the economics, how do we keep up with this growth that we experienced here? That's an important aspect of this for our community.
Yeah.
So, and I think, Angela, you can talk a little bit about this too, because in your book, you talk a lot about green infrastructure versus the, business as usual practices, or you call it gray infrastructure. And we talk a little bit about the importance of combining those interests, different public interests in creating green infrastructure versus business as usual.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the best examples of that is the city of Chicago, and there's lots of cities that have been doing, city of Philadelphia. And the reason I bring it up is because they got approval from the EPA to sort of meet their clean water standards differently. And the arguments they use is said, hey, we can do the big pipe, but this is like multi-million dollars. And by the time it's done, many, many years down the road, we'll have already reached capacity. And the only benefit it's going to do is stormwater. However, if we manage it on site, it has climate change adaptation and resilience opportunities. It's less points of failure, right? It's not one big system that can fail, it's multiple points. Similar to having energy on this, dealt with on site, or wastewater dealt with on site. And they also talked about the ability to get funding from different departments by combining forces. So Philadelphia is a really interesting example because they have a cabinet level approach. They were 100 resilient cities, Rockefeller 100 resilient cities, and they got a cabinet level for their local government position, which really helped coalesce sort of political action. But what they did was that they said every time there needed to be stormwater management or a park revamp, they got the decision makers at the table, not the lower downs, the real decision makers at the table. And they said, is this an opportunity for stormwater management? Is this an opportunity for park revamp? So to revamp, they've got a whole project on sort of regenerating their park infrastructure. Is this a way to increase community engagement? And so because they're all at the table at the same time, they are really able to use dollars more effectively under, quite frankly, a pretty limited budget. And that, I think that's the first thing, is that you could do it for green infrastructure, as well as making sure the community is helping to maintain it. To be clear, in those rainwater and those stormwater ones, they do have catchment tanks underneath the system, and that slows it down because, Philly gets a lot of rain, unlike where I live and where you live. And that does cost money, but not nearly as much as those big pipe solutions. What the Philadelphia Water Department is learning is they said that we can't have engineers in charge of this anymore. They're absolutely at the table, but they can't say, hey, this is the way I do it. This is like, and the community involvement is like, yeah, this is what we're doing. Okay, bye. Like, we did that, check the box, done. So no, they have to build that into their process. And the city of Toronto was kind of shocked when they heard, best cities talk to one another, best case practices. They said, what? You need 30% of our budget for community engagement? They're just shocked by that, but that is what is going to make it successful. If you've got a different goal, so the 606 in Chicago, that was sort of a community investment goal, but it also was meant to be active transportation. So they were able to draw upon federal funding to reduce congestion and increase active transportation. So they could draw on that funding. But like what Alden's mentioning, there's a lot of fundraising, usually by third parties, sometimes the business district, in the Philadelphia example, the rail park. They said this is an area of disinvestment. If we sort of pool money together, this is going to raise the whole community, or public-private funding. They're really being creative around that, of how to fund these different projects.
Those are some great examples. And again, I keep coming back to what I know in this arid climate, and water is actually, you mentioned earlier in the chat too, Las Vegas is known for returning the water. But what do you do before it gets there? Before you throw it in the pipe and get it to the Las Vegas Wash and back to Lake Mead? What can we do with it? How can we use it as a resource or a place for create points of interest? So I think that's a challenge, and I love the cooperation between the different sectors. So
it was amazing. I mean, as Alden can attest to, anything environmental, the benefits are never enough to be justified economically by one department. It just does, the numbers don't add up. And the same thing goes for anything at a building scale. So in order to get those sort of so-called externalities or larger benefits, you need to have it divided amongst multiple departments. That's the only way it financially makes sense.
Right.
Or just to reframe divided against departments, and you're right from the departments, but stacking value. We have to be stacking value so that this, isn't looked at as just a piece of land that we're redeveloping, that it's the environmental impacts, which have economic infrastructure impacts, which then affects the public health and everything else. And can increase tourism, as often happens when you have that art element, as Angela was talking about. So there, when you start to look at it from that perspective, these end up being potentially drivers instead of add-ons. And I think one of the things that I have been heartened by in the course of since COVID showed up in our world, and there's not much to be heartened by, but there is this, which is that I think this idea of green spaces or nature places has gone from an amenity, and I'm just not a big fan of that word, but I know it shows up all over the place, but because from amenity to necessity to essential, we recognized its essentialness to our human experience and to the health and well-being of our people and our places. And so I think there has been a change and a shift in funding. I mean, there are now foundations who didn't deal with nature-based solutions who are looking at that for health reasons. And so that is a shift that's happening. And so I think there is, and it's changing with people, as everything does on some level in your own backyard, like people who either experienced it or didn't, but they had some reaction to it, and therefore are motivated in a new way. So I'm excited about what's to come on that.
Yeah, and then the environmental justification, I'm glad you mentioned it, because I don't know if we spend enough time talking about heat island effects and what these spaces can do to reduce that. So Craig, you can pop on. I know we have a few questions, and we get to some of those before we end today.
There's some really good ones that I'd sure like to ask if we have time. One of them is, what are some of the ways you can track health and well-being improvement metrics?
Dr. Loder, do you want to go first?
Sure.
I have a few, but yours are going to be better.
There's a lot of different ways. There's been a lot of studies done at population level, which looks at population level outcomes and access to green space. That is really basic, and they've shown, population level outcomes. And that's done by researchers and drawn on by city level work. You can look at, I think probably that is the most effective way to sort of look at metrics at a population level. You can look at how much green space you have, and you look at public health data. BRFIS is a very well-known used database by public health agencies. That's probably a good way for a large scale, but you need to also have that small scale, I'll call them case studies, the kind of work that Alden's doing, the kind of work that lets you have those interviews, those journaling. Photo voice is another way to do it. And that's not necessarily anecdotal. Qualitative research is it's rigorous. There's whole forests being destroyed and discussing different methods, but it really tells you the why, right? So statistics and surveys tell you the what, but qualitative research tells you the why, what's really going on. And the best designed survey in the world, and I run the survey program at IWI, you're not going to be able to anticipate every single thing that's going on. And that's why you need to hear from people what is really going on around place-based values. That's how you're going to anticipate, wait a minute, there's going to be issues of green gentrification in this neighborhood. We should look at a land trust. That's how you're going to be able to identify other issues you couldn't possibly have anticipated to begin with. So there's well-established metrics on the benefits of health for nature. I could go on and on about those different ones, but I think at a city level for projects like this, using a combination of publicly available data along with small case studies is a great way to go. And part of that's part of that adaptive planning process in which you have ecologists at the table, you have community members at the table, researchers at the table, and it's been very successful examples of them combining to say, we think pretty sure this is going to work, and now we're tracking the outcomes, and that's happening in the 606 and the vacant lot program in Chicago. Now we're tracking the outcomes with researchers.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, which is not nearly the expansive answer that you gave, Angela, but one particular example that's recent, and there's a lot on the health arena, but is burnout. And I mentioning it because obviously nurses and physicians are experiencing extreme burnout, but to some extent we have all been pressurized in the last year and a half in terms of burnout, not to mention Zoom burnout and everything else, right? But there is some great data that came out of Legacy Hospital with Dr. Roger Ulrich on the statistically significant reduction in nurse burnout when they went to an outdoor green space, or in this case, it was a sacred place specifically, versus a very attractive break room. By the way, I went to, and it is a very attractive break room that has, you can see nature. So it's not some, incandescent light place. And the difference is very significant. So getting out into these spaces, even, yes, you can reduce it in 20 seconds, but for 20 minutes can have a meaningful impact in people's lives. And I think that's something for us to keep aware of across platforms and across different sectors.
Great story. Craig, is there another question?
Yeah, there's a couple more questions, and I'm going to try to combine this one because I think they're asked maybe a little bit differently. But one person said, "What do you think? Why do you think some public entities can be resistant to integrating green spaces into urban areas?" And then the next question, which I think ties in here, is that how do we move these processes of regreening from reactive to a more significant portion of new planning and design?
It's a great question. I think there's risk, and I think we're seeing that a lot with people at a building scale as well. There's a concern that if they add green space, they're going to deal with the problems associated with green space. They don't want to talk about maintenance. Nobody wants to talk about maintenance, right? Plants are living things and they do need maintenance. Buildings need maintenance too, but for some reason there's a resistance to plants. So I think we need to do a much better job at talking about the benefits from plants. And I think in terms of being proactive around it, I think we need to move from a risk management, what's the minimum we can do, to a sort of like proactive, I am doing preventative care. I am avoiding this many costs by doing preventative care. I'm doing due diligence by identifying problems or giving these kinds of spaces to begin with. And that really, I think, is incredibly important when we're talking about this sort of hybrid work environment we're moving into. Some organizations have called it workplace making. Most likely, most of us are working at home and in the office. That's changing our expectations of what our neighborhood provides. We were just talking before we got online about, almost 50% increase in desire for residents that are looking for places to live in New York that want access to outdoor green space. 50% in the last 8 or 9 months. So I think if somebody's not thinking about this as a way to make that neighborhood a safe space to socialize with COVID, to provide amenities, to be a buffer for mental health and stress, they're not going to do that well. These condos, for example, that are offering very creative ways of having outdoor space are not having to reduce their prices in a market where other New York apartments are having to reduce their prices. Alden.
I'm not sure I can add very much on that one.
I could go on. I'm trying to be equal here.
Well, but let me kind of reframe that a little bit for you, Alden. If how do we create policies within cities that help us do this work, which we all know is work that needs to be done, and we seems like in some urban environments the policies don't allow it.
Yeah, I am by no means a policy expert, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, but I do know that there are different structures that we can put in place, whether it's within low-income housing and getting extra points or what have you, or having it be an opportunity to have these green spaces be a part of this. This is part of what Angela does in her day job at IWBI. Like, as we think about well buildings, but putting that instead of just within the corporation, which you put it into the political and the policymaking sector. I think that that's a key piece of it. But I think also, we've had several fire souls who have been trying to essentially take over, and they've done a little bit of like guerrilla style takeover of city parks, but that have been disregarded for not years, decades. And so making that process, if there is stewardship within a community, making that transfer easier, because if the city's not going to take care of it, but the community is, let them take care of it. As opposed to being so hardlined about it, or create a leasing structure or something like that. But again, I'm not the policy wonk in the room, but I think that there are ways that our public leaders can really ease up on some of the issues around that if there are good and solid organizations in place to help take that lead. For us, it has always been about public-private partnerships. I mean, because no one can do it by it themselves effectively over time.
Just to add on to Alden's great comments, climate change adaptation and mitigation, I think, is another vehicle that we just can't do business as usual. Our cities are too hot, they're burning up, we're having extreme weather events, and nature-based solutions are going to be a huge component of that. So why not design them? They also have human health benefits.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Great point. Do we have any more? I know we're getting up to time and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So
well, I had one more question, and this was
okay.
my question.
Oh.
Sorry. How do you create conditions where you can get the most out of community engagement?
Well, I think it's always a process. You have to know what you're walking into. I think that's why we have always relied on the Fire Soul, because that Fire Soul is from that community. So they're going to be able to A, brief you better, and B, sort of walk you into the room. So there's more trust in that room by virtue of you standing next to this Fire Soul, this community leader, because they are the ones who know and love these people on a day-to-day basis. And I think the other thing is, really, especially in this era, thinking as much as we can about all different types of people and their considerations. So one of the things that we found in this time of COVID and Zoom world is that people who perhaps have disabilities or can't leave their kids at night to go join a community meeting, they have more access. There's more things happening because they can access things through Zoom. So really being thoughtful about childcare, being thoughtful about different perspectives in the room, creating safe space and setting tenets up front for how we interact with one another when we're in those community engagement meetings, I think is a really critical piece to, creating a common set of understanding so that we can approach each other with the love and respect of everyone's contribution. I think that's a really, it might sound Pollyanna, but it's so critical to us improving ourselves and our communities in the bigger way.
Yeah, Alden, those are excellent points. And I think the only thing I'd add is the most successful community engagement is top down and bottom up. So it's not enough to just schedule a meeting that, as Alden mentioned, may not have childcare or be transit accessible or all the different things. Food helps genuinely. But having the people that are running the community engagement, cities are usually too busy. The most successful examples you've seen is they've had a third party or a nonprofit or a foundation that's doing that. But that foundation is empowered to make real decisions because it's supported at a policy level by the city. If you only have the city level or you only have the bottoms up, as you said, people do guerrilla gardening and it goes nowhere, right? What you need is that community activism combines with that precedent, usually in their official plans, like they have set goals for the amount of green space per person they're not meeting. That is that sweet spot. That's kind of tactical urbanism, that sweet spot. We saw that even with, a lot of use with walkability, right? That tactical urbanism, the city and complete streets, where the city said we want to support this, the community is working together, and that's where you get that connection. And I think using pilots, using sort of temporary installations can be a really great way to get people to rethink what is possible, and they'll fight harder then for that reimagined city and those reimagined spaces.
Wow. Well, I think just I'd like to close off with maybe what's next for each of you, and maybe we'll kind of close with that, and we'll talk about giving everyone a kind of a close after that.
Well, we have a I've been doing a couple papers if you're interested on translating biophilic design at scale. So the research that the academics use and is usually justified doesn't always line up to the biophilic design principles. And there's good reasons for that, but the biophilic design principles talk about those values and conflicts and sense of place. They really have a lot of value. So that was really fun to work on. And we have our global research agenda. Our fourth quarter impact topic is access to nature. So we're going to be having a webcast on December 2nd and some publications related to that.
Awesome. I think we'll provide links to everyone watching and whoever registered for that, for those resources. Thank you, Angela. Alden, what's next for you?
Well, we are working on a variety of things, but the big thing is we're trying to double our sacred places in the next 5 years. So we are about 1 year into our 5-year plan, and we have about 22 in our pipeline this year. And so we're looking to expand our footprint as one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is we also recognize we can't create all the nature spaces that are needed. And so we are working with landscape architects and designers to do, we're going to be kicking off a certification process next year, or doing education process to help just get the word out about this, recognizing that there's so many groups like yourselves who are interested and who are values aligned and want to be thoughtful about this. And there might be an opportunity or two that just comes through your door. And the third piece of this is really expanding our Fireside network. And so our network really does a lot of peer-to-peer learning, but we also do enrichment and enhancement grants so that we can continue to help these incredible people who are on the ground every day trying to bring wellness to their communities. And so whatever ways we can help, we're there.
That's awesome. It's great to see like-minded, community interests, and I cannot and we cannot thank you enough, Angela and Alden, for joining us today. This has been great. I can keep going. I would like to keep going, but I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. And I think this is I'm going to rewatch this so I can really now absorb in all the content, because there's a lot of great learning today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. It's a pleasure to be with Alden, who I hold in very high esteem, and the rest of you. So thank you.
It's a joy. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to do a quick close. So thank you for everyone for joining today. And we talked about Nature Sacred, and you see the website here. We'll also include this in the email next week, but please check out Alden's organization. There's a lot of great resources, a lot of great material. You'll see a lot of beautiful projects and examples of sacred places. In addition, look up Angela Loder's book, Small Scale Urban Greening, if you want to learn more about the concepts we talked about today. Her book was the inspiration for a lot of the questions we asked, and there's a lot of areas we didn't cover, so I encourage you to look it up, and we'll provide an Amazon link to that book also. So this is our last fireside chat of the year, unfortunately. We're making plans for next year, so we're looking on continuing bringing in great panelists and experts in the fields that we care about in our community. So be on the lookout. And again, I want to thank Alden and Angela for today. So I'm going to close today. So thank you all. Have a great night.